everyone. This is Janet, and I'm hoping you are all well and healthy and staying sane out there given our situation. I hope I get to see you all again soon. This week in oceanography, we're going to be talking about biological productivity, and this is the first of 3 lectures on biological productivity. When we talk about biological productivity, we're talking about 2 concepts, and this is what we're going to be focusing on today. The first concept is changing carbon dioxide into sugars through photosynthesis, but the big fancy way we think about this is we call it carbon fixation, so fixing carbon by primary producers. These are just photosynthesizers. And then we also think about how the things that are made by photosynthesis, so the change in energy from carbon dioxide into sugars, how that energy is transferred and how matter is also transferred as well through the levels of the food chain. So basically, photosynthesis and all the stuff that eats photosynthesizers is what we're talking about when we say biological productivity. So what is carbon fixation? When we talk about carbon fixation, we're talking about taking carbon from carbon dioxide gas, which is a non-living form of it, okay? It's not associated with living things, all right? So carbon dioxide gas and converting it into molecules that are associated with living things. And in this case, we're talking about sugar. So converting carbon dioxide to sugar. To do this, you have to have energy. So carbon dioxide is CO2, and this is its molecule here. Carbon, 1 carbon, 2 oxygens. And then this molecule over here, this is glucose, which is the type of sugar that plants make. It is not only a larger molecule, but it has energy stored in it, more energy stored in it than this molecule does. So you have to basically take a step up in energy if you want to make sugars. So you have to have some sort of energy to do that. Photosynthesis uses energy from the sun to do this. It converts solar energy into what we consider chemical energy, where energy is stored in molecules. Chemosynthesis can also be used to do this too, to drive food chains, but it's relatively rare on Earth. Almost all the biomass of the oceans comes from photosynthesis. When we talk about biomass, we're simply talking about the amount of matter. So the amount of plants out there, the amount of animals out there, zooplankton, phytoplankton, all these things, all right? Almost all of that relies either directly or indirectly on photosynthesis. And when I say directly, I mean plants rely directly on it, but animals rely indirectly because they're not actually photosynthesizing, but they're eating the photosynthesizers, or they're eating the things that eat the photosynthesizers. Just like cows eat grass directly, and then you maybe have a hamburger and eat cows, right? You're still relying on photosynthesis for that hamburger. Let's talk a little bit about photosynthesis and what it is. So when we talk about photosynthesis, it's a relatively simple chemical reaction. It has carbon and oxygen and hydrogen. And these are taken into photosynthesis in the form of carbon dioxide and water. All right. Now, if you're a plant that's on land, this carbon dioxide is in all the air surrounding you. It's part of the air. So the air around us, the atmosphere, is mostly nitrogen, but then there's a lot of other things in there, including carbon dioxide, oxygen, some hydrogen, a little bit of helium, things like that, right? If you're a plant on land, this is in the gas surrounding you. If you are a photosynthesizer in the ocean, if you're a plankton, a phytoplankton, then this carbon dioxide is actually dissolved in the water surrounding you. So gases can dissolve into water. And carbon dioxide is one of those gases that's dissolved in water. Oxygen is also dissolved in water in the oceans. All right, so that's where our phytoplanktons are getting this. It's dissolved carbon dioxide. So these two molecules go into photosynthesis. Plants use chlorophyll, which is a type of pigment, and that chlorophyll can take the sun's energy and it can recombine these elements into sugars and into oxygen. So you can see there's still carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen coming out, but in different form. And this type of molecule, because it's taking the sun's energy, it's actually storing that energy. All right. So the energy on this side of the equation is greater than the energy on this side of the equation because we put it in from the sun. And this energy that is stored, this is what powers ecosystems. This is what powers the food chain. All right. So in the ocean, our photosynthesizers, the things that do all this work for us, lots of things can do with that. So the first thing would be cyanobacteria. All right, they photosynthesize. And then we have diatoms and dinoflagellates. We talked about these quite a bit already. So these are all the phytoplankters. There are other phytoplankters as well, but these are the main phytoplankters. So these guys all photosynthesize. We also have large photosynthesizers, all right? We have seagrass. We talked about kelp last week. And surrounding us here in Georgia, Georgia has some of the largest salt marshes in the world. So salt marshes are composed of plants and they all photosynthesize and they fix carbon. So these are big photosynthesizers that are found in the oceans. Now, if photosynthesis is taking carbon dioxide and water, adding energy and storing that energy in sugars and getting out oxygen, respiration is exactly the opposite of it. All right, so photosynthesis fixes carbon and stores energy. Respiration takes stored energy, liberates it, and you can see that we have exactly the opposite things. So this photosynthesis has carbon dioxide and water and energy that goes in. Respiration, what comes out? Carbon dioxide, water, and energy. What comes out of photosynthesis is sugar and oxygen. What goes into respiration? Sugar and oxygen. These are literally the opposite processes. All right, so photosynthesis basically stores energy from the sun. Respiration liberates energy from the sun. When we talk about the things that photosynthesize in the world, we call them autotrophs. And autotrophs are things that feed themselves. Auto means self, right? And troph, anything with the word troph means feeding, basically, or nutrition. So autotrophs feed themselves. And we also call these primary producers. So they're the ones who perform photosynthesis and convert CO2 to sugar. And in the ocean, we have things like seagrass, we have salt marshes, we have diatoms and dinoflagellates. When we talk about things that respire, we call these heterotrophs. So again, this means feeding or nutrition. Hetero means different. So they need to, anything that's a heterotroph needs to get its nutrition from something else. That's what this is telling us. We also call these consumers. And they use the energy stored in sugars either directly or indirectly. In the oceans, these would include things like our copepods, which are a type of zooplankton, our schooling fishes like these herring, Atlantic herring, large predators like bluefin tuna, and us. Now, one of the points that I want to make is that although plants are the only thing that can photosynthesize, they also need to respire. So photosynthesis stores energy in sugar. When plants want to use that sugar to do things like move, to grow, to reproduce, anything like that, when they want to use the energy, they also have to respire. So plants and things like phytoplankton need to both photosynthesize and respire. And in fact, at night, they don't photosynthesize at all. At night, they only respire. So everything up here photosynthesizes and respires. Down here, they only respire. All right, so keep that in mind. Plants not only photosynthesize, they also respire. Let's put this into the perspective of an ecosystem. Well, so what is an ecosystem? When we talk about an ecosystem, we're talking about all of the parts of the environment, the chemicals, all the physical things that are happening, the geological things that are happening, and the biological things that are happening. So it's the sort of the encompassment of everything, all right? And ecosystems function because we have matter in them and we have energy in them. And this matter and energy is basically moving through the entire ecosystem. Now, this moves through in slightly different ways, and we're going to talk about that here. The simplest way to think about matter and energy in an ecosystem is to create a food chain, which only follows the course of basically one direction, one path in an ecosystem. It starts with the primary producers or the photosynthesizers, in this case, a diatom. These are photosynthesizing and reproducing, and then you might have a plankton bloom where you have a lot of them that are available to eat. And they get eaten by things like zooplankton. So these are copepods. We've talked about them before. They're the next level of our food chain. And they're delicious, so a lot of things eat them, including things like these Atlantic herring, right? These schooling fish. They're also delicious. So we go up one more level in our food chain. What might eat an Atlantic herring? Well, one of these bluefin tunas. All right. We've talked about bluefin tuna before when we talked about fish's strategy to reduce drag, to be very, very efficient and fast swimmers. Now, at the top of our food chain, we might have us. All right. So, little side note here. These bluefin tuna are highly valued for sushi. And if you live in places like New England, people go out in the summer and they fish for these. And they can, if they catch one of these, they can grow very, very large, like 1,000 pounds, 1,500 pounds. They can be huge. And they're valuable. They're very, very valuable. A really large bluefin tuna might sell for something like $30,000 for one fish. So a lot of people try and go out and catch them. And when they are caught, they basically are flown to Japan overnight and used for sushi. All right, so we've got the top of our food chain here. If you like sushi and you go to Japan, you'd be likely to have bluefin tuna on the menu. Of course, that would be a really expensive type of sushi. So here's a very, very simple food chain of things that photosynthesize and fix carbon, and then matter and energy flow through the food chain. We saw another food chain last week when we talked about the idea of trophic cascades and keystone species. When we had kelp at the bottom, they were our primary producer, and we had a grazer in our purple sea urchin, and then we had a predator here in our sea otter. So what's actually moving through the food chain when we make it? The things that are transferring in a food chain are matter and energy. So matter would be things like nitrogen or phosphorus, micronutrients. If you take a daily vitamin, you know, anything that's in that daily vitamin, anything that you eat, all right, it's made up of matter. Right? So matter is flowing from one level to the next. All right, that's one thing that's going on. But also all along the way, everything in here has waste products. It has urine, it has feces, right? So everybody poops, right? So all of this matter is either going up the food chain or is exiting it at a particular level. And when it exits it, it is being broken down. The matter in it, the nutrients in it, are being broken down by decomposers. And these are primarily the bacteria. And this is a good thing. It's a good thing we have bacteria. Imagine that all of the living things that ever lived before you did not decompose. All of their matter was captured in their body and buried. Eventually, there wouldn't be anything to make you, right? So we need to have matter recycle through the food chain. And that happens because of decomposers. They basically take all this stuff, the urine, the poop, the dead bodies, and they break it down and they make it into something that's available again to flow back through the food chain. So matter is recycled over and over in ecosystems. And it's recycled through starting with as dissolved inorganic nutrients and then becoming encompassed into bodies and flowing through again. All right, so this is a key concept about ecosystems. If you're taking notes, write this down. Matter cycles through an ecosystem. Energy, on the other hand, does not cycle through. Once energy gets through the food chain, it is not available to be reused. So energy enters the food chain down here with the photosynthesizers. They take solar energy and they convert it into sugars, which is a type of chemical energy, right? And that energy can get passed up the food chain, but not all of it is. Most of the energy that an organism takes into its body does not get passed up. Instead, it's used for just everyday living. Things like moving, things like thinking. Your body uses a lot of energy to think. The brain is really, really energy hungry. All right. So things like thinking. A lot of it is just used for moving muscles. All of these things result in heat loss. Think about when you move a lot, when you exercise a lot, you get hot. It's because energy is being broken, the chemical bonds are being broken, that energy is being liberated, and you are losing it through heat. All right, so that heat dissipates into the atmosphere and eventually dissipates out into the universe. So energy comes into the food chain, some of it gets transferred up, but eventually all of it gets lost as heat. This is another key concept about ecosystems. Energy does not get recycled. Energy flows through and eventually is lost. So this is what this looks like. The key idea here is that matter cycles, but energy is lost. And when we look at this, energy is the orangey red. It comes in through sunlight. It passes through different levels, but every single, and some of it goes to decomposers, but every single one of these levels loses their heat to heat loss, loses their energy to heat loss, right? So energy flows through. Mass, however, matter recycles. And you can see we have this cycling that goes around and around and around. So this is the difference between matter and energy in an ecosystem. Now, when we talk about how matter and energy move, we talk about trophic relationships. Trophic, again, is anything having to do with food or nutrition, all right? And we have relationships between different parts of the ecosystem. We have down here the first trophic level, and then the second, and then the third. So we can just talk about what level it is, but then we call each one of these levels a different thing. So the things that photosynthesize, we call primary producers. The things that eat primary producers are called primary consumers. Sometimes we call these grazers as well. And then we have secondary consumers, tertiary consumers, and quaternary consumers, all right? And then we have another way to think about this, phytoplankton, zooplankton, and we might call these herbivores, things that eat plants. We have carnivores. Anything that is a carnivore eats other animals. Now, this up here, I really probably shouldn't have put carnivores for us because we're not just carnivores. Every once in a while, I know I like to eat a salad. And so really, I'm an omnivore. Humans are omnivores, not carnivores. So that's another word that we might use to describe a particular type of organism. The food chain is the simplest way to think about this relationship. It's the simplest way to think about how matter and energy move through an ecosystem. But in reality, ecosystems are much more complex than this. There's not just one path for matter and energy to take through an ecosystem. In reality, things are much more complex, and a better way to think about this would be to think about this as a food web, which is a network of interconnected food chains. So at the bottom here, diatoms aren't the only thing on the bottom, right? There's all sorts of things down here, such as our dinoflagellates. Now, if you're a copepod, you might eat a diatom, but you also might eat a dinoflagellate, right? Or if you're a diatom, you might get eaten by a copepod, or you might get eaten by a euphosid. If you've heard of the word krill, these are krill. All right. So this shows some of the complexity of how things actually work in an ecosystem. And it can be much more complex. So think about these copepods. Copepods are an incredibly important part of ecosystems. They are lipid rich, they are delicious, and they are incredibly numerous. So lots and lots of things eat them. We have the schooling fish of our original food chain, but we have other zooplankton. This is an arrowworm. They are ravenous and tremendous predators, and they will eat zooplankton. We have other types of fish like the sand lance. And then we have even things like right whales. So the right whale eats copepods. So, and this is only a small fraction of the things that eat copepods. I could fill this slide and probably 20 more with things that eat copepods. So at each level, there's this extremely complex web of things that eat each other. If we compare a food chain to a food web, the food chain is just one path, a single path. If you think about a one atom of carbon that is used by dinoflagellates by a dinoflagellate to make sugar, and that if we look at that one molecule of carbon, it might pass through just this path. But in reality, if we think about all of the molecules of carbon in a particular ecosystem, they might pass through any one of these paths. And so you might have lots and lots of ways you can get from the bottom to the top. All right, so that's the difference between a food web and a food chain. The food web is really more realistic. It's impossible to actually draw out an entire food web, though, because it's so complex. A final way to think about trophic relationships is to draw what we can either call an energy pyramid or a trophic pyramid. And this shows our different levels of organisms, and it shows their relative abundance. So we have a lot more biomass at the bottom than we have at the top. If you take all of the phytoplankton of the world, take it out of the water and weigh it. And then you take all of the zooplankton out of the oceans of the world, take it out of the water and combine it and weigh it. This level will have more biomass, will weigh more than this level. In fact, it will have a lot more. There'll be about 10 times the amount of biomass at this level than there is at this level. And that's true for all of this. For every step up, you have about 1/10 of the biomass of what happens below it, because a lot of energy is lost as it flows because of just things like heat loss. All right, so you need to have a lot more phytoplankton than zooplankton. You have a lot more zooplankton than primary carnivores, etc., etc. That's why there's not very many sharks out there in the ocean. Right? If you think about the Serengeti, right? Out on the Serengeti, the plains of the Serengeti, think about how many zebras there are compared to lions. There's a lot more zebras than lions. And that has to happen because you need to have enough energy to support the next level up. So this shows the relative amount of biomass and energy that are at each level. We're going to talk a little bit about how animals feed. So animals can feed in a variety of ways, and the first way we want to talk about is grazers. Grazers are just things that eat plants. All right, so we talked about purple sea urchins last week. They graze on kelp. Quite a lot of snails are herbivores, and they will graze on things like this is seaweed. So this is a Littorina littorea found in tide pools in New England, and they eat seaweed. We have some types of fish that eat seaweed. So this guy eats seaweeds in coral reefs. And then here are two really popular grazers. We have the manatee and the green sea turtle, and they love to eat anything green. They love to eat, in this case, seagrass. Our next way of animals feeding would be predation. So these are all predators. We have the arrowworm, that's a type of zooplankton that preys on other zooplankters. And this is another zooplankter. So this is an amphipod, and you can see it's surrounded by all these little things. These are all copepods. You can see the relative size of this plankter compared to the copepods. And he's really happy right now. He's surrounded by a buffet of delicious copepods. So he's a predator. This is another type of zooplankter. So the jellyfish, they prey on all sorts of things. They can prey on zooplankton, they can prey on fish, on basically whatever they can sting and get to their mouths. Seabirds are predators, and a lot of fish are predators. So remember how I said that last week that this guy has reduced his drag so much that he's a really good sprinter, a really fast swimmer. Well, he's designed to be fast so he can basically outswim his prey and catch them. A lot of animals are scavengers, and they can either be scavengers full-time or they can be scavengers part-time. A scavenger, basically, if they find something dead, they eat it. They don't have to catch it, they just eat it. And I love this example. So this is off the coast of Cape Cod. This is a dead humpback whale. It's floating on its back. This is its belly, right? This is one of its pectoral fins. And who's taking a big bite of it? But this is a big female great white shark. I mean, think about, well, great white sharks are predators, right? You always see this on Shark Week. But in fact, they're not always predators. They're willing to take a free meal. And this is a great free meal because it's easy to catch. It's not going to swim away from it, right? There's no possibility this shark is going to get hurt when it's eating it. Its prey is not going to hurt it. And man, humpback whales are full of fats and lipids, and that's exactly what she wants so she can produce a lot of babies. So she's not above being a scavenger. She finds a nice free meal floating around out there. She's going to enjoy it. This is once this whale basically floats to the bottom, when it sinks to the bottom, eventually, a lot of things are going to eat it. A lot of things are going to scavenge off of it, but eventually it's going to sink to the bottom. And when it sinks to the bottom, it becomes what's called a whale fall. Whale fall communities are something that we really didn't know about until about 15 years ago. And they turn out to be really important ecosystems that they have animals that are specifically evolved just to take advantage of whale falls. So this whale carcass falls down to the bottom of the ocean, and it is surrounded by scavengers who will live on it for years and years, basically extracting energy and nutrients from it. So all of these guys are scavengers. Our final example, this is a seal carcass. It's hard to tell what it is, but it's a seal carcass on the coast of Namibia, and it is being scavenged by a huge amount of land crabs up on the beach. If you've heard of like ghost crabs that we have here in Georgia, these are a relative of ghost crabs. And ghost crabs are scavengers, and these guys are scavengers who just found a huge, huge buffet. Now, we've seen filter feeders before, but I want to talk about filter feeding a little bit more in depth. So filter feeding is basically getting things out of the water, small things out of the water. And usually these are phytoplankton that these animals are getting. There are two types of filter feeding. There's active filter feeding where you create a current, and there's passive filter feeding where you don't create a current. So these barnacles are passive because even though you're going to see a lot of movement, they're not making a current. So here they are. They're using their little ceropodia, those I like to think of them as like catcher's mitts, to reach out into the water and grab anything that might be in the water that they can eat. So this is what we call passive filter feeding. Now, active filter feeders make a current, and a great example would be this sponge. But some other things like would be mussels, any sort of clam. They are active filter feeders who make a current, and you're going to be able to see that current here. Basically, it's sucking water into its sides, and that water is getting filtered and then it's shooting out this chamber. I wanted to include some big filter feeders as well. This is a manta ray. This is a basking shark. And these are whale sharks. These are actually from the Atlanta Aquarium. This picture's from the Atlanta Aquarium. These are all filter feeders who basically swim through the water with their mouth open. And they have something called gill rakers that behave very similarly to baleen, and they filter zooplankton out of the water. All right, so these are some great big guys, but here are probably the most famous of the large filter feeders. These are great whales, and a lot of great whales, although not all of them, many of them are filter feeders who have baleen in their mouths, just like the right whale we talked about last week. And these are humpback whales. They basically swim into a school of fish. They open their mouth really wide, and they actually have these pleats, see these on their belly, that allow them to take a lot of water into their mouth, and then they filter the water and they get all of the small fish out. So here they are. And our last type of feeding is deposit feeding. And these are all animals who basically look along the bottom of the ocean. They glean out anything on the bottom that might have nutritional value. This guy, we've actually talked about him. He's a spaghetti worm, but he's out of his burrow. Someone has actually dug him out of his burrow. And these are those tentacles. They're all sort of mashed up, but this is the spaghetti worm. These are both local species. So this is a fiddler crab, and these are snails in local salt marshes. All right, so these are deposit feeders, and they're just looking for anything on the bottom that they might eat. The final type of organism that I want to make sure we talk about are the decomposers, and these are primarily the bacteria. These are the really important part of the ecosystem because they allow matter to cycle through the ecosystem. They do this by secreting enzymes. Enzymes are proteins that help chemical reactions occur. They cause chemical reactions to occur. And this allows bacteria to break down organic matter, to break down ammonia. Ammonia is toxic to most organisms, and there's a lot of it in the ocean because things urinate, and that's not good. So bacteria will break that down. They can break down even some things that are really hard to break down, like cellulose. Cellulose is very hard to break down, and it's found in things like the cell walls of plants. So this makes matter available to plants. This basically makes the building blocks of matter available to the next generation in an ecosystem. So we're going to talk about two types of bacteria, and this diagram actually, I think it came from like an aquarium supply company. Forget about the uneaten food. They're actually kind of thinking like, oh, you're in an aquarium and fish don't eat food and that becomes some waste. Just think about this fish here. he poops and he pees, and also he dies, right? So when especially when he pees, he puts ammonia into the water, and ammonia is not a nice thing for other organisms. So the great thing is that bacteria can change ammonia. So this type of bacteria, Nitrosomonas, he can change ammonia into something called nitrite, which is also not good for living for most living organisms. But nitrite is changed by another type of bacteria into nitrate, and nitrate can then be used by plants. So if this were in the ocean, we'd have ammonia that gets converted to nitrite, that gets converted to nitrate, and then that nitrate can be used by phytoplankton. We here in Glynn County are surrounded by salt marshes. We have the most amazing salt marshes on the east coast of the United States, right here in our backyard. And if you've ever smelled that rotten egg smell, then you have smelled the handiwork of bacteria. So if we think about the bottom of the ocean, especially in coastal environments, we have the seawater up here. And then imagine that you could just see a cross section of what's below that. What you would see would be a small layer, a thin layer of gray mud. And this gray mud has oxygen in it, especially at the top, there's a lot of oxygen. That oxygen level drops as you get deeper and deeper until there's no oxygen. Everything up here, if you live up here, you have oxygen to breathe. So it's called aerobic. It means that you can have aerobic respiration. Aerobic means it uses oxygen. All right. But if you live down here, there is no oxygen. It's black. It's anaerobic. And one thing we see down here is that although there's no oxygen, there is hydrogen sulfide. And this level of hydrogen sulfide increases the deeper you go. This is what this looks like. The very, very top, you can see a thin layer of gray mud. That's the aerobic mud. But the black, that's anaerobic, and that smells like rotten eggs. So what is happening when you smell that? When you smell that, that's because anaerobic bacteria, bacteria that don't need oxygen, they're producing um, a chemical reaction that liberates oxygen. They take SO4 and they break it into oxygen, which then they can use to respire, and sulfur. And this sulfur has a negative charge to it. See that? S2 minus. So it's an ion, all right? It's an anion. These anions are charged and they're out there looking for a match that has the opposite charge. They're looking for positively charged atoms or molecules. And what they find hydrogen ions. Hydrogen ions have a positive charge. And pH, if you've heard of the idea of pH and acidity and alkalinity, what we're really talking about pH is the availability, the abundance of hydrogen ions. If you have a low pH, it means there's a lot of hydrogen ions. They're very reactive. And in ocean water and in the mud, we have some hydrogen ions that are available. They will combine because these are plus and these are minus. They will combine and we'll get this H2S. And this is hydrogen sulfide and it smells like rotten eggs. So if you smell that when you go by a marsh, you're smelling the handiwork of bacteria. Our final topic today is about chemosynthesis. And most of the primary productivity on our planet is photosynthesis, but that's not true completely. In the late 1970s, Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, they created this little guy here. He's called Alvin, and he is a deep diving submersible. He can take a couple people down to the deepest parts of our ocean. And they sent an expedition out here to the Galapagos Rift. So this is a spreading sea plate, right? So these are diverging plates. And this is Central America. This is South America. And so this is the Pacific Ocean. Here's the Galapagos Islands. We've seen them before, right? So this is spreading here. And they didn't know what they would find, but there were some anomalies in the seawater near there that made them curious. And so they sent this expedition, and this guy went down to the bottom, and they found areas where they saw white smokers that looked like this, and they also saw black smokers, where seawater was basically getting down into the earth, down into the magma, and was being forced out into the ocean. And it's full of chemicals that it picked up while it was down in the earth. And it's also very, very, very hot, like 350 degrees, super, super hot. Um, and they kind of expected to see something like this, but in addition to seeing this, they found an abundance and a diversity of life that shocked them. They found these things, which are a type of worm. They found these things. There's a fish here, and then these are all shrimp. And you can see there's a ton of them. They found clams. They found octopus. They found fish. This is some sort of like wolf eel-y kind of thing. And you can see that he's on clams covered in shrimp. This is just, oh, and there's a crab there. There's a ton of living things down there. But one thing that they did not find, they found no photosynthesizers. And that makes sense because sunlight does not penetrate very deeply into the water. All right, when you get down to the bottom, it's just pitch black. And so there's no sun, there's no solar radiation, there's no solar energy to use as the basis of a food chain. Right? So it was shocking to them that they would find this amazing abundance of life and this great diversity of life, because where was the energy coming from? Right? It was really like an amazing discovery, one of the most amazing and important discoveries of the 20th century. So what is happening in this ecosystem? In hydrothermal vent ecosystems, rather than having photosynthesis, we have chemosynthesis that is occurring, where you take carbon dioxide and water and hydrogen sulfide, okay? And this has a lot of energy in it. This energy is converted into sugar energy, which is then available for respiration, and into other sulfur compounds. All right. So you're taking one type of energy here in hydrogen sulfide, and you're just converting it into another. All right. And this happens in these organisms because they are all full of symbiotic bacteria. So these organisms house within them bacteria that can chemosynthesize. So all these mussels, worms, snails, they don't eat. Rather, inside of them, they have these bacteria that produce sugar. They take all this stuff around them and they produce sugar. And then the sugar is available for these organisms to use to respire. All right, so that's what's happening in hydrothermal vent communities. We're going to finish off today just by taking a look at what this looks like. We're not going to look at this entire video, but I want you to see what it looks like when the alveolin goes down and what they see down there and how these organisms can use symbiotic bacteria and chemosynthesis to survive.
They were on the hunt for deep-sea hydrothermal vents caused by the rift between those continental plates. Their existence had been predicted for decades, but no one had ever seen them. At a depth of 7,500 feet, their temperature sensors spiked. They had reached volcanically superheated water gushing through the ocean floor. But they also found something that utterly surprised them: life. in extreme abundance, weird and wonderful. How could this underworld support so much life? There is zero sunlight here, skull-crushing pressures, and yet the Alvin crew have discovered a hidden ecosystem. This was not what they had expected. They were the first to ever set human eyes on this environment, rich and full of life like an underwater rainforest. And then they found the worms. These bizarre creatures are tube worms. They are giants that can grow over 6 feet long. Their bodies are encased in white tubes anchored to the rocks. At their upper end is a spectacular crimson plume. It looks like a tube of lipstick that's been pushed out too far. Or like maybe Mick Jagger's lips? The Alvin team knew that they had come upon a wonderful zoological oddity. What they didn't know was that the worms would reveal an undiscovered ecosystem that we didn't even think was possible. The Alvin crew collects one of the worms and gives it to this man. This is Meredith Jones, the Smithsonian Institution's curator of worms, and as befits his role as chief worm guy, he gives the thing a name, Riftia pachyptala. Jones dissects the worm, and he encounters something that, to us as non-worm people, is really weird. Riftia has no mouth, no gut, no anus. This thing has no way in, no way out. How does it survive if it can't eat, digest, poop? Well, Jones, as a curator of worms, had seen this kind of thing before, gutless worms. Instead of a gut, these worms have an organ called a trophosome. It's brown and spongy and makes up half the creature's length. A trophosome isn't technically a gut, but it does deal with nutrition. But this trophosome was different because there was nothing remotely like food in it. Instead, it was packed with crystals of pure sulfur. Something was going on inside this worm that Jones had never seen before. And that's when Colleen Kavanagh enters the picture.
I was a first-year graduate student at Harvard, taking a course called Nature and Regulation of Marine Ecosystems. And the professors organized so that there were 4 talks on the vents.
Jones came in to give a talk about his worms. It was a long talk.
Amazingly, I was still awake when he mentioned that in this trophosome tissue, it had sulfur crystals in it.
Well, Jones knew that the water spewing from the hydrothermal vents had a high concentration of hydrogen sulfide, a potent toxin to most life forms. So maybe the trophosome wasn't an organ to help feed the worm. Maybe it was a filter, something to help get rid of all the poisonous hydrogen sulfide. And when she heard that,
I immediately jumped up and said, it's clear they must have symbiotic sulfur-oxidizing bacteria inside of their tissues that are feeding the worm.
bacteria?
Bacteria.
And how did Jones react?
He was a little bit dismissive. It was a little bit like, sit down, kid. Ultimately, I was able to get some tissue.
Of the trophosome?
Of the trophosome. So it looks like little pieces of brown tissue. It took a lot of detective work, chemical analyses, DNA stains, scanning electron microscopy, transmission electron microscopy.
Ultimately,
I was right.
So Colleen discovered that trillions of bacteria are living in the trophosome, using the hydrogen sulfide from the vents as an energy source, in a process called chemosynthesis.
Chemosynthesis is a process using chemicals such as hydrogen sulfide as energy sources,
as opposed to photosynthesis, which uses sunlight.
Okay, folks, so we're going to continue to talk about biological productivity on our next lecture, and I hope you're well, and I will talk to you then. Everybody take care. Bye.